I'm going to talk about a natural disaster, the Nepal earthquake, and there's an underlying theme of complexity. So I'm going to pick up on, Steve sort of alluded to this explicitly and implicitly. In terms of because it's complex, I hope that I'll be able to get some of these issues across in a simple enough way. Some of you are familiar with the system, some of you less so. So I hope I won't lose those of you who are not familiar with the system along the way, but do feel free to ask questions afterwards or come and talk to me bilaterally. When I talk about the system, I'm talking about predominantly referring to the IASC agencies. So this is the global level highest forum for sort of actors, the not-for-profit actors that do humanitarian work. So that's the UN system, that's the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, and international NGOs. So I'm predominantly referring to these actors. And I'm going to be talking about a lot of system limitations. So this is the system as a whole, the international humanitarian system, as opposed to one particular organisation or a number of organisations that are particularly strong or particularly weak. I see these things as system issues and system problems, and that's why I want to highlight here. The term humanitarian circus, when you have for those of you who know, when you have a big disaster, and it's a relatively benign disaster as well, where you can get in, you're not going to be shot at, and natural disasters particularly, and there's lots of funds, you get all sorts of people coming in. You get these international sort of humanitarian actors, but you get all manner of people coming in, one-person organisations, all sorts of people come out of the woodwork. So it's like a grand circus. So we had a bit of the circus effect in Nepal. Just a little bit about my journey. I mean, many years ago I sort of went to a talk, and there was a RedR engineer talking at that, and I was really inspired by that, and I decided to get into this sort of work. I sort of, it took a few years before I managed to make a connection. I started working as an engineer in water and sanitation, much more sort of hands-on stuff back in the 90s. These days I do a lot more in terms of sort of coordination, management, bureaucratic stuff. I'm a grand bureaucratic functionary now. I don't do anything, I just sort of try and coordinate. So different sorts of work. My journey in terms of what I do has shifted, as indeed the system's shifted. So for some good reasons as well. So the Nepal earthquake, I'm sure all of you know that there was a very significant earthquake earlier on this year on the 25th of April, Richter scale 7.8, and quite massive effects. These were the figures of people affected at the time. The figures shifted over time, and I'll touch upon that. So you'll see some other figures a bit later that don't correspond with these. But that was the snapshot at the time. And then there was a subsequent, there's always lots of aftershocks, but there was a subsequent massive aftershock, considered to be an aftershock on May the 12th, which caused further extensive damage, basically damaging buildings that were already weakened. So this is the map of Nepal here. So Kathmandu sort of being here, and these were the areas that were thought to be initially affected. So the epicenter was here to the northwest, up near Gorkha, and then the second, the May the 12th aftershock was here, further to the east, and then radiating out some effects in India and Tibet. So the initial response was really pitched as a level 3 crisis. So here I'm going to refer to the international system, the IASC. When there is a level 3 crisis, it means it's so big that it's of global significance, and there has to be a global system-wide mobilization. It's that big. And Haiti earthquake in 2010, the Pakistan floods in 2010, were retrospectively, they would be considered as level 3 crisis. When you have a level 2 crisis, it means it's big, but perhaps it can be handled in regions, so it doesn't require such a large mobilization. The point for me, though, is that this earthquake, and I was involved in some of the preparedness planning in years beforehand, wasn't as large as the worst case scenario. It's really only a level 3 crisis, but the system as a whole responded, I think, as a level 3 crisis. So In other words, I think that the collective response was oversized, if you will. We triggered lots of stuff coming in, and that brings to problems. And there's a sort of no regrets policy. Well, let's make sure we respond more than enough because we don't want to be wrong-footed, which is really what happened in Haiti and Pakistan. So the international humanitarian system is sensitive to these issues. It doesn't want to under-respond, but over-responding brings problems, and I'll talk about some of those. So my role in Nepal was as the WASH cluster coordinator. So for water, sanitation and hygiene response. I was there working for UNICEF and with the government of Nepal counterpart. So it's like a co-leadership role to coordinate water and sanitation and hygiene action. So the issues I'm going to talk about are very present in Nepal, but I've done these roles in Yemen in 2013 and Philippines later in 2013. And I think they are system issues. So those are the 5 issues I'm going to cover here. I just want to give you a sort of a cynicism warning. I'm focusing on the things I think don't work. There's lots of things that do work, so I don't want you to leave the room and think it's an absolute collective failure. It's not. I think for me it's more important that we examine these systemic issues and actually ask ourselves, so how do we improve these so the good things we do become are supported more by these sort of addressing the system issues. So I'm just giving you one side of the story. There is a positive side as well. Please don't lose sight of that. I talked about the level 2 or level 3 crisis. So I think there was an oversurge. And just some data I'd like to share with you. And I shared this with a senior UN OCHA official from New York, John Ging, when he came over for a visit. And I highlighted this issue of oversurging. 74 urban search and rescue teams, 19 lives saved. These are very expensive. I couldn't find costs on these. From the date of the earthquake, the April earthquake, so over 42,000 foreign visas issued. Overwhelming majority would have been people coming in. And this gives you a measure of how much stuff was when people came in. And then let's look at the sort of response from a Nepali perspective. And this headline here was particularly telling. I extracted these. It's just a couple of days before the UN official came out. What the earthquake has taught us. Government needs money, not foreign experts. Some of you will have heard that before. Here, all the money going into the top. How much actually comes out for sort of affected people? And it talks about benefiting beneficiaries. So, the national newspapers, the government, the people, civil society in those countries, they see this surge. And I think so it's important that we get it right. If there's oversupply, people will form a view. And there is evidence and studies out there that show that there's an expectation. One of the trends is that national governments and regional bodies will assert more authority over responses in future. So there's a whole host of reasons why we get this surge right. There is pushback with change. So was it cost effective? Was it acceptable to oversurge? And what trends might we see in the future? How can we spend money more effectively? I think that for me, one of the most important things is transparency about budgets and costs. DFID as a donor talks a lot about cost effectiveness, as do other donors. So I think a lot more transparency about the total expenditure on aid for all actors, whether it's funds from institutional donors, funds going through the UN system, and indeed civil society funding. So I think we need more openness about that. Second issue, I think the system's becoming increasingly complex and it's sort of in danger of paralysing itself. You talked, Steve, about the cluster system. The cluster system's been evaluated. In general, the word is, well, it works. It's work in progress, but on balance. Having been doing this for 8 years, I think it's getting increasingly complex and increasingly it requires so much energy just to sort of manage upwards, to reporting upwards, that it's actually in danger of paralysing itself. And again, it's a point I think we need to be less focused on the global level, reporting up donors and elsewhere to the public media. We need to be focused more in terms of managing the response. I want to give you one example of complexity, and there are many, and Steve, again, you sort of talked about this, but Philippines response here. The big problem there was that these coordination mechanisms didn't, the geographical areas didn't coincide with the government administrative boundaries. So we created a coordination hubs based upon where the damage was, but not fitting in with the administrative centres. That created more complexity in the Philippines response. In Nepal, there was a fit with the government administrative boundaries. Some of this complexity is self-induced, I would say. That's one example. So how do we stop the system from becoming overbearing, bureaucratic, and unmanageable? Which I think, personally, from my experience the past few years, is becoming increasingly so. I think we need to standardise, to simplify, reduce the demands for reporting, and the reporting going up. And it's turning down the global spotlight. You know, the demands to know every few hours what's going on, looking up rather than actually working in that locality. Assessing needs and caseloads. A bit of data here, and I'm going to look at these graphs here. We've got three lines here. We've got the so-called caseload here, and this is the amount of the numbers of people in need of a particular thing. In this case, hygiene kits and sustained long-term sanitation. Okay. So we try and determine in the early days how many people we think need hygiene kits. And the way we did this is say, okay, there's about 1 million houses. It's about it's 1.5 million houses destroyed. They one each need a hygiene kit, and there's about as much again houses that are partially damaged. So most of those will need a hygiene kit as well. So we're trying to sort of set at the macro level, the national level, the amount of needs. Then we have the red line here, which is the target, and this is each organisation, IMC, UNICEF, Oxfam, MSF, they're collectively saying, in our areas, this is the target. So you add all those up. That may not be the same as that, and then you track the amount of people reached. So that's what we're trying to do here. What and what we're interested in increasingly is the gap. First of all, what's the rate of delivery of assistance? Have agencies actually said they're going to meet the overall need? Or is there a gap between this and that? And you can see how these plots change over time. And we need to be able to know these things, but it's actually quite complex getting these estimates and data. There's lots of technicalities here I can't go into. But this is what the global level looks like. They say there's a huge gap here. What are you doing about it? It's a valid question. Then we sort of know the overall caseload. Then we have to think about what factors count. Well, of course, the earthquake impact counts. That's obvious. That's self-evident. House is destroyed. But maybe there are some other things we need to think about. What's called the physical vulnerability. Nepal's a mountainous country. So up here is high mountains. So the community in the country agreed that those communities up near the border in the mountainous areas had physical vulnerability because they're remote access and winter coming and snows. So there's another factor there. And then a third factor, the socio-economic factor. What about those communities that had underlying poverty? So it's not just their house has fallen down, but they were poor before. So there are other factors we need to build into this. It's not just about the damage. Then the next thing we have to do is to understand, well, are all the agencies in the right place? We know that these are the priority areas from our overall assessment, and then these areas are the priorities. Are the agencies actually in the places where the priorities are? So we go through this exercise of sort of mapping and trying to understand, have we got the people in the right locations to actually deliver that assistance? So there's a big question about how we get this macro level picture and to be able to steer agencies. I think for me that one system reform we need is an independent body for assessment. There's lots of conflicts of interest, I think, with agencies doing their own assessments. It's a bit like, if you wanted your work done in your house, rather than you decide what needs to do, you get a sort of a builder to come in and tell you what needs to be done, and then the builder gets the job to do it. Sort of a bit like that. We need greater clarity about what are the most critical things to do, and pre-agreed case protocols for caseload, how we define what the need is. The heart of coordination is about this sort of gap analysis and overlaps, and the analogy I like to give, or the picture I like to give, is this idea of a jigsaw. We have a sort of a crisis, and then all these different organisations represented by different pieces of the jigsaw coming in. And what we're trying to do at the coordination level is to make sure, try as far as possible to steer these pieces into the right place. So we don't have gaps, and we don't have pieces of jigsaw on top of each other. We don't have overlaps. Okay. So, and agencies generally flock to where they think there are gaps. And I just want to sort of highlight some data from, first of all, from Nepal and Philippines, that I think shows that actually the system doesn't do very well at coordinating. These colours represent degrees of assistance delivered against the caseload, the need. But basically, if we look at red where there is quite a lot, there's quite a lot less assistance delivered compared to the need, and green looks like oversupply. So I'm looking at this, and I used to look at this every sort of few days and think we've got big gaps. We've also got oversupply. It doesn't look like a very coordinated picture. There's some reasons behind this, but overall that looks quite poor. In terms of Philippines, a similar picture for shelter, is responsible for shelter coordination. In this area here, the data I was looking at was showing 2.5 times the amount of stuff supplied compared to what we thought was needed. And in the interior here, actually way under supply. And there was lots of chronic poverty here. We knew that from the data. So again, a real mismatch. So agencies go for damage, but maybe not poverty. It's pretty crude. They went to where the tidal surge did the damage. And I think in my role as a coordinator, I only steered about 5 to 10% of efforts. We've got quite agencies work with independent mandates, and they go where they think the need is. But often we don't get a very good match, I think, sort of data I'm looking at. So there's a good study by Alnap, and it talked about coordination, spectrum coordination, from complete autonomy to merger. And the system assumes we're operating at a level up here where we can influence what people do and where they go. In reality, it's a lot less. And as highlighted by some evaluations, strategy documents don't have much influence. I've written strategy documents with others. People don't follow them, they do their own thing. So actually, do we have a system that functions in the way we want it to or think? I think we probably don't. So I think we need to be able to, we're going to get more directive government control in future. I think that is coming, or even non-state actor control. We need to be able to have more real-time information to coordinate effectively. And I just want to focus a little bit on the right type of assistance, hygiene kits. I think we've drifted into actually overcomplicating things. We know the basic essential items for hygiene. We've moved to a more comprehensive kit, rather than just soaps, water containers, and sanitary items, menstruation towels, cloth. We've now moved to toothbrushes and other things. We're getting into more trucking and chucking, helicoptering around toothbrushes. It's crazy. Do we need to be distributing hygiene kits in urban areas, for example? Why don't we give cash for toothbrushes? These sorts of markets do operate. So I think we've just got into a programming that really isn't very clever in terms of household water treatment, giving people the means to disinfect their water in their household. And what we had here, this data here, is this is how much we thought the need was. This is how much agencies said they were going to do collectively, and this is how much was supplied. So this looks like an oversupply. So that's what we're reporting. We were reporting on stuff given out, chlorine tablets and chlorine liquid. In reality, most people weren't using it in the way they would have to use it. They weren't using it at all. They were storing it as water medicine. So we knew this. This issue occurred in Bangladesh in 2007, the same issue. It comes up time and time again. And yet we're giving this stuff out truck and chuck. And actually it's rather disingenuous, I believe, to report that people will use these things when we know they don't. The last programme issue is like just around sanitation, toilets. We're talking about latrines. Emergency latrines would be what would be built first of all. Very necessary, where you had these IDP camps, internally displaced camps. There's about 120,000 people in middle of July in these IDP camps, small schools and other areas under tents and so on. Most of the work was being done in the villages where houses were damaged or destroyed. So lots of issues. Agencies they provided that emergency temporary latrine, shared family. We were getting information back, not what people want. They didn't want to share. There were land and space constraints, and there were people with no toilets before. What we were trying to do at the coordination level was to shift away from an emergency modality to a more development modality. That was really difficult to do. We were stuck in a sort of emergency mentality. Right for some locations, but overwhelmingly needed to shift to development. So just my challenge back to the system is, I think these are known and predictable weaknesses in the programmatic response. How can we manage it better in the future? I think at the global level there needs to be a better leadership to actually have what I call predefined program policy based upon evidence, what we know works. And maybe we need to think about quality control through accreditation. There is some debate about that and some system reform issues. But I think we're doing there's still a lot of amateur stuff done, even amongst the professional agencies, let alone the other, non-traditional circus actors, the one person and their dog coming in. I mean, it's just fundamentally, it's deeply inefficient and wasteful. So those are the sort of the 5 key issues that I've talked about, and I'll leave those up because they may prompt some questions, or you may have some other questions.
Thank you very much.
You're both sort of hinting at this like thirst for comms and this thirst for sending information back. What extent do you think that's damaging the whole profession, the industry, the people, and how can it be fixed?
Get an instant report, you ask instantly. Now I find you're notifying the donor at the same time you're notifying your HQ now. That didn't happen before, but it's just this kind of concept of liability has crept in. And the thing is, the whole case of it should be that as an agency you can look at what's happened. What did you do wrong? What did you do right? What are the lessons from this? But you're panicking in the information, you're making sure the information. I'm in a regional position, I go up to a global position, and then it's going above there. And then the thing is, you're saying to the country director, have you told the donor? And it's not that it matters what you're going to learn from this, it's just like, we don't want to be liable. And I think that's a change in the culture I'd highlight with the information flow.
Coordination with the local knowledge as well as local grassroots organizations as having a big role in order, because from my experience I saw that most of the organizations actually undermining that side of the incorporating the knowledge of the local knowledge as well as local grassroots organizations in planning as well as monitoring, and because this also, on the other hand, they give you accountability as well as not only your accountability. Most of the time accountability is toward the donors, but where is the accountability toward the beneficiaries themselves? That is the big. The other thing also you mentioned, government control to the entire process. I think if I'm wrong, you can correct me. But in case of in some developing countries, you might find really corrupted governments. So how can you guarantee that this program will be implemented appropriately if you are going to handle or deliver this, or if the government are going to take control of the whole system?
I mean, accountability to beneficiaries. I think many international NGOs have been much stronger in this than the UN system through the Humanitarian Accountability Project, HAP International. So that's been stronger in the international NGO community. I think in civil society in general, because they're closer. I mean, the UN's catching up, and OCHA sort of is now taking that more on board. In terms of the question you asked about national civil society actors, the cluster evaluations, the 2 cluster evaluations that were done, both highlight the fact that there isn't enough effort put on taking account of existing coordination structures in country, so-called development, of which of course government will be present where it's in government controlled areas. So that's recognised as a system weakness, so great that you point that out. That's being addressed to some extent, but not enough. And it's certainly an even bigger weakness is the absence of civil society local actors in those coordinate. The system is so loud and international, if you like, and increasingly has to talk upwards to the global level, that it's hard to find space. I think it's getting worse. But these are good questions, and they're recognised as systemic weaknesses. So yes, and in terms of the government, well, where the government is the government performing well in situations of armed conflict where there may be a party to the conflict? That's a very real concern. So balancing the, if you like, the nature, the role of government, notwithstanding ultimately, remember that any government has a responsibility, the final responsibility for its citizens and responding to their needs. That's their responsibility. But recognising where a government is party to a conflict, or maybe corrupt and so on and so forth. So finding that balance is important. We don't really have any metrics to do that per se. I mean, I would say, Nepal. You look at the Transparency International Index. It's very poor in terms of corruption. However, that's one international metric. May not be recognised by the Nepal government. But I actually found day-to-day working with the departmental level colleagues of rural water supply and sanitation, they were I think we were trying to do the right thing. So I felt that at the departmental level it's possible to operate with government officials in a way that it's much harder with political people at a higher level. But of course each situation is quite different, and there's judgments, and there's lots of different interpretations and different organisations. I mean, organisations like the ICRC have a particular role and manage that relationship very different. MSF as an organisation keeps a level of separation from the international community and the UN because it considers it a whole host of issues. So different actors work in different ways. I don't know if that answers that complex question.
It's not even just NGOs, even though I've seen UN bodies that would traditionally lead clusters in one thing now lead in something that totally isn't their sector specialities. But I think especially NGOs, in the bigger they get, and I think it's been driven, especially almost since 2008, since the financial crisis as well, this desire to move out, to try and get more funding, that they have to have their fingers in so many pies, and you get flag planting all over the place that just makes, for a coordinator like yourself, the whole thing incredibly complex. You also maybe lose the skills because people who are traditionally education specialists have suddenly got a shelter arm or a wash arm that they didn't traditionally have. And I guess the question is, do you feel, what might be the answer to that from of coordinating bodies or what have you? Is it right that all these agencies, because they're pushed in one arm by donors to be able to do everything, yet at the same time I feel it's part of a bigger part of the problem that is creating the murkiness and either missing gaps, overcompensating everything that's happening by this approach that's being sort of pushed from one end, it is also causing problems. I don't know what you feel. Is it better to have all these agencies that can do everything, or more specialised agencies?
I mean, the humanitarian system is very complex system. Anyone who knows about sort of studying complex systems, one of the aspects of them, because there's so many variables and factors, if you try to over control, they will stifle and become paralysed. And what we're observing, and I think Steve, you talked about that, is more control is inducing this paralysis. We're going to lock the whole system down because it is complex. We need to have a level of, we need to be operating, and there's mathematical study of this, so you can look at this. But this, what the mathematical study shows, that you need to bring things down from the sort of chaos threshold to the highly dynamic threshold. Otherwise, there will be chaos. But if you try to control it too much, then it's going to lock up, and then it becomes dysfunctional. I'll spend all my time generating data to report to New York, and whoever else wants to read it, and not actually dealing with the issues. My ability to deal with the sort of the programmatic issues. Okay, people, we know the water disinfection is not being used. My ability to deal with that issue as a coordinator was compromised by having to generate data up to the global level. So more controls, we're going to lock the system down. It'll become dysfunctional. But I think we do need to sort out the wheat from the chaff. We need to have. There's value in having a range of different organisations, different mandates, doing different things. And some can be more flexible than others. So that gives us a robustness. But sometimes when you get these one-person shows and people who, frankly speaking, bringing stuff that's deeply inappropriate, it's rubbish. It clogs up my time. If I have to speak to someone who knows nothing about anything and explain to them, again, that's not being strategic. So we do have to find a way to actually deal with some of the sort of the really low capacity, low experience crap. We need to get rid of some of the amateurism, but we don't want to have too much control. So it's that middle ground.
It was really on what's happening now in Nepal. So I was there a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed to me that Humanitarian Circus is moving on. The big top's coming down. Just a few of the clowns left. There's still a lot of people there, but there's also a lot of work that hasn't been completed. So there's a lot of buildings in Kathmandu that are damaged, but people are literally painting over that damage now. There's a cinema in Kathmandu that has a big crack across the ceiling, and the cinema owners are now charging half price to try and get people into the cinema. Are we missing the opportunity? We talk about sort of build back better and increasing, resilience and reducing future vulnerabilities. Isn't this where we should be, particularly for RedR and our engineers? We should be going in.
So in 2001, the Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake. That's sort of, and thinking about the Japanese tsunami. It takes, even highly developed societies, it takes a long time to go through this whole process of recovery. So the first sort of comment. In terms of the whole building back, well, of course, building resilience in is the work of the development organisations. It should be done before a disaster. So the opportunities to build back better. That's now the sort of the prevailing wisdom and doctrine. Whether it happens, there's an interesting study by CRS that I heard at the UK Shelter Forum just before the day before the earthquake in Nepal, and they actually identified what really makes a difference. And what really makes a difference in terms of building back better for houses was not giving out IEC materials. In other words, this is how you build your house to be stronger. It's actually demonstration models and cash and some training. So I think we've got the sort of the message is loud and clear: build back better. But I don't think it's being done that well, and I think we need to have a better evidence as what actually makes a difference for the likes of you and me. If we had to build back better, well, actually getting some drawings, which is what the system works at the moment. So, yeah.
On the remark side, I think it's true that it's oversized as a response in Nepal, but it's not just a question of how do you assess the situation in a given time frame, but it's also a question of how much pressure there is from the outside. I know just as an example, from the Swiss government side, they did not send their search and rescue team but it was extremely hard to take that decision because there was so much pressure from the parliament and from the public to send search and rescue team. So I think it's more than just an organization who can take a decision or a donor who can take a decision. I think there's a big variety of issues in order to evaluate the situation correctly and take the correct decision. And the question on the budget, you were saying more transparent budgeting, transparency in general would be helpful. I agree, but I also feel that it won't work unless the donors and the organizations that have the biggest funds are not joining in. It's good that small humanitarian organizations do it, but as long as the big organizations are not doing it, it's not going to work. So how could we make that possible? Because in the past there have been so many tries to do that, and it's never worked out. What is the incentive and how could it be done?
In Nepal, with the work that OCHA's sort of taken on this theme, and there's a couple of organisations in DFID that are funding this, and I think it's great, really powerful. One organisation, they gave a presentation to some of the cluster coordinators, and they said one of the projects was basically to track funding, and really interesting. And this person sort of said, Nepali, said what we're going to do is we're going to be tracking the funding. It's not just big donor funding. We're tracking the DEC, Disasters Emergencies Committee, which raises funds in the UK. And he said, we're going to track the DEC funding, see how much Oxfam got, I just use Oxfam as an example, and see what gets through. So I think that if it comes from actually telling people affected by disaster what they get and how the money is spent, I think that's the right way to do it. So sort of starting, if you like, from the bottom up, telling people what they get from search and rescues. You know, economists can't put costs on lives lost in terms of sort of lives lost through illness, days lost, economic impact of illness. You know, all these things can be quantified in some way. So we can compare to some extent the apples of international search and rescue teams and helicopters, and we can start to get that out. I think in Nepal, the system spent far too much money on helicopters, and it could have mobilised porters to be carrying loads up into the mountains much earlier on. But we do sort of helicopters. But I think if we had put the data out there about the cost of these different investing in response, I think we'd have a much more honest debate. And I think we need to have that with the public as well as the politicians, everyone. So, but yeah, the donors and the big organisations have to lead with that.